Yeah, it's funny you brought up busy work and bureaucracy. And there's a need for definitely there's a need for certain policies to be created and followed, and it's usually a result of a mistake being made at some point or somebody doing something that's dangerous, near miss type thing. Um, but the the steps that you want to walk through, the checklist that you want somebody to follow, the processes that you want you to follow, the different line items that you want them to acknowledge that they understand, having them check off that they understand is not the same as actually assessing whether or not they understand that information. And I can speak from my own experience in doing training, especially a long time ago when I worked in the oil and gas sector, and just all of the safety training really just boiled down to um, we need to tick a box that says this person completed this training. And it was just for the purpose of, shifting liability. And that's really what it boiled down to was we need to shift liability to the individual employee by saying, yeah, they acknowledge that they've completed this training that we walked them through. And they have passed this 20 question assessment where the instructor was standing at the front of the room and handing out the answers because everybody passes and nobody fails. And there's no real learning that's going on in that environment, where you sit down and you watch a half an hour PowerPoint that's outdated by 25 years, and then you get that quiz at the end that everybody's sharing answers on. I shouldn't say there's no learning, but there's very little learning that's going on in that environment. And it seems to me like that's not even the point of it. And I think for a lot of organizations, they kind of morph into that. It starts with good intentions, and we need people to understand this information and acknowledge that they understood this information. So it seems to me probably what gets missed is how do we actually assess whether or not they've understood this information, and what do we do when they haven't? Maybe that's a problem that organizations run into. It's yeah, how do we assess whether this person has understood the key concepts here, whether they can demonstrate competency, and what do we do when they can't? Not an easy not an easy question to answer, I suppose,
Yeah.
because the reality is that if you force people through additional training, that's more time and effort. But there's other things you can do, and we talked about this recently, where you can take things off the front end by doing, assessments right out of the get-go, intake assessments of sorts to determine competency in the beginning and shave training time off some people who are maybe more experienced or come from industries that are similar or come from jobs that they did the exact same work, but within a different company. And you can shave time off the front end for those employees in terms of their training and get them through faster, and then take some of those additional training hours that some of the employees don't need, and use them for the employees that are a little bit more maybe less experienced and require a little bit more time and effort to bring them up to what is acceptable levels of competency to do their job safely and effectively.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is sort of the incentive and the reason why you do something. I think if you're going to have buy-in, like if you're going to do something where it's why is this on the checklist, right? Is it something that you're forced to do? Is it something that you want to do just because somebody else is telling, some other organization is telling you you have to do it? Are you doing it because you actually think, it's for better for your employees or better for your performance of your company and things like that? I think, all of these things factor into it. I think a lot of times, items on a checklist when it's forced on you from somewhere else, you do tend to put in the minimal effort you need to be able to get your job done, right? And then all it effectively adds is, like you said, like a paper trail on who to blame when something goes wrong, right? And at least it gives you that, and functionally that becomes a purpose that it serves. And I
Hmm.
think that evolves through how those rules are applied and that kind of thing, right? I think most people will take the path of least resistance on most things. Um, and if you don't feel like it's worth the extra effort, or that the extra effort is not really required for you to get, what you need to get out the other side, you're going to take the path of least resistance, and you're going to try to, do as little as you need to be able to check that thing off the list, right? I think you have to assume that everybody's going to act, rationally in that sense, right? So I think that's like a much bigger discussion because I do think there's different ways that you can kind of you can kind of approach like how who makes the list, who makes the requirements, and then I think you have on the other foot on the other end of things. Um, Places where, like, if we're talking about employers that really want to just do the minimal that's required to them of the by the government or something like that, you've got one group there, and you do have another group that I think is that wants to add more and more items onto the list because that's sort of their job, right? So I think there are incentives, and I think there's that book Bullshit Jobs about people who have this kind of mentality, not mentality, incentive structure where managers want to create more items on the checklist so that there's more that they can do, and then they hire more people, and it feels like there's more going on. They have more responsibility, and therefore they add even more things onto their checklist. And the more they add, the more, the bigger their team grows, the more important they feel, even if they're not getting the core, you know, purpose, they're not fulfilling the core purpose of their organization or their company, but they feel like, they're growing in size, and they're growing because they're creating more work to be done. And I think that's, there's an incentive to do that as well, right? There's a bunch of incentive to constantly be adding more to the list of things to do for different reasons.